This lecture will focus on the first couple of years, known as the early stages of the Civil War. So Lincoln knew that he had to get those troops ready, but he also felt pressure at the very beginning to strike quickly against the South to attack and stop this war quickly. And he knew that Confederate troops were starting to gather about 25 miles south of Washington, D.C., right along the Bull Run River, Manassas Junction, and he decided that he would authorize an attack. And so he authorized this strike on Bull Run, which is a river, and we can see right here where it is on this map, right? Okay. And this was known as the first Battle of Bull Run. That kind of tells you there's going to be another one in the same spot, but let's continue on. All right. Again, Lincoln was pressured to attack quickly. The Confederate troops were gathering there, and so the Union troops decided to attack and fight them and finally defeat them and be done with this whole thing. And they went in and attacked, and they were forced to face that these troops were a lot better than them. The South's troops were a lot better and better led and everything like that. And so they had to retreat. They panicked. They freaked out. The whole thing of war happening was too much for them, and so they ran away. And that's when Lincoln realized this might not be a short war that you can just win super quickly. And we really, to be able to fight against the South, we need a very well trained and big army to defeat the South because they're such a strong, good army. And so he signed a bill, he had just signed a bill to try to get 75,000 men to join the army for 3 months. And now he changed it to where he signed another bill for 500,000 men to enlist for 3 years. So they had to find those men from the states in the north. And so both sides had to decide how are we going to get these troops? How are we going to get the troops that we need to make these large armies? And so the South decided to go with conscription, and they went with conscription really pretty early because they just, the enlistment levels were not that high as time went on. And so in April of 1862, they went with conscription. Again, the draft of all white men between the ages of 18 and 35 years old. Now, there were a lot of exemptions. The exemptions were government workers, teachers, people with more than 20 slaves, plantation owners. Okay, those kind of peoples were all exempt from conscription. So they did not have to do it. They didn't have to fight or even be part of the draft. In the North, they switched it up a little bit. They tried a number of things before they ran out of options and had to go to conscription. They started with a bounty, which was if you serve out your whole 3 years, then you get bonus money. And so you come in, you join the army. If you last for those 3 years, we'll give you bonus money. If you quit before then, you kind of lose out on that money. The second was the Militia Act, and the Militia Act was an act that Congress pushed through that gave Lincoln the authority to call state militias, and the state militias would include those drafted troops that the states had drafted, the conscription. Okay, after all of this kind of failed to meet the needs, which was in 1863, so a few years into the war, the North also had to use conscription to get enough troops to fight this battle, or these battles, the whole war. The war at sea, the Navy was going a lot better for the North. Starting off talking about their blockade that they had set up, they had sealed off every port in the South except for Charleston, South Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina, pretty quickly. And what that did is it essentially cut off trade from the South with the rest of the world. There were still small ships that could get through with a little bit of supplies. They were called Blockade Runners, these small, fast smugglers that could get between the blockades when they weren't around, because you can't have a literal line of ships. They didn't have that much. They just had ships patrolling the area. However, the shipping was just so much less than before the war that they were really running out of supplies quickly. Confederate ships were trying to shut this down, trying to make the North hurt as well. A couple of ships the Alabama and the Florida were working out of foreign ports. They were working out of other people's ports and would go in and attack the northern merchant ships. And so it kind of shut down the people who were trading from the north. And that made America very mad because these ships were not built in the South. They were built in Britain and sold to the South. And so America was not happy about that, and they went to Britain and demanded payment for those damages that the British ships had done, even though they were being commanded by the Southern people. Um, Another kind of piece of what was happening was David Farragut. David Farragut was in charge of 42 warships, and there were 15,000 soldiers aboard these warships that were led by General Benjamin Butler, another guy. And Farragut really became a hero as he's moving through in this Civil War era. Okay. Um, in April, he started to attack these Confederate forts on the Mississippi River, on the lower Mississippi, so that he could get into New Orleans and take it. So these were the things that were protecting or keeping him from New Orleans. His attacks were not able to destroy those forts. Those forts were strong, and he couldn't do it. So he made a brave decision, as David Farragut always does, because he was a big risk taker. And he lined his 42 warships up, kept them as far away on the river as he could from the bombarding people, and decided just to sail on past them. Okay. Now, this was really, really dangerous because this would expose them to attack. So the forts started to open fire and shoot at these ships. Confederate gunboats were trying to come in and ram them and sink the ships, and tugboats were out pulling out these flaming rafts, just these big balls of wood and fire out into the river right in front of the Union ships. And amazingly, all of Farragut's ships, except for 4, made it through this battle, got through, and were able to continue upriver. And soon after, on April 25th, he arrived at New Orleans with most of his ships and most of his soldiers intact. And within about 6 days, the troops that were aboard those ships were able to take New Orleans. And so the South's largest city, the center of the cotton trade, was now in Union's hands. So the war in the West was also going good for the Union under the direction of Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, we'll see him later multiple times, and so he was the Union general that was in charge of taking control of the Cumberland and Tennessee River. That was kind of his goal, and what that would do is it would provide the Union with a river route where they wouldn't be messed with all the way deep into the Confederate lands, deep into the Confederacy. And so he did this and pretty quickly had all of Kentucky and most of western Tennessee under Union control. And so that was a big deal. One of the big battles that he was part of was the Battle of Shiloh. What happened with this was Ulysses S. Grant led his troops to Corinth, which was a city in Tennessee, and he cut the train off from the Mississippi River and Tennessee. So essentially, this was a big train town, and it didn't allow those Confederate people to move things out to the Mississippi River and trade or move their troops or anything like that. And so the Confederate troops, to get that back, did do a sneak attack near church. The church's name was Shiloh. That's what the battle's named after. And Grant kind of backed up a little bit. He got a defensive line together and waited for reinforcements. This is something the North is able to do that the South doesn't have the luxury of. And so this is where a lot of the winning happens. The next morning, the Union knew the reinforcements were coming or were almost arrived, and so they attacked, and they were able to force a Confederate retreat because the Confederates knew they did not have those reinforcements coming in the same number. So at this point, this was the bloodiest battle so far, and it stunned both sides because there were 20,000 troops in this Battle of Shiloh that were either killed or wounded if you include both sides. That's a really large number of people compared to previous wars. Take a moment to write out an answer to checkpoint number 1. All right, we're going to see a little bit more of the same in this next battle here in the West. The Confederates, under their new general, their new commander, General Braxton Bragg, moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, as they were retreating from this Corinth area. And the General Braxton Bragg, decided to invade Kentucky and try and get the Union Army to kind of follow him and give Tennessee a little bit of relief. And he did that. He decided to attack. However, he came up against another Union general, Don Carlos Buell, and Don Carlos Buell was able to stop them. And so he stopped them, and they had to start to retreat back towards Chattanooga. And President Lincoln, ordered Buell to go in and take Chattanooga. And so Buell started to slowly move towards that, but Lincoln was very frustrated by how slow it was going and took Buell out of being in charge of this attack. He put General William Rosecrans in charge. So our guys that we've got so far are Braxton Bragg, who's a Confederate general in charge, and then we have Don Carlos Buell, who is a Union general, and now General William Rosecrans, Union general as well. And the attack happened near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on Stones River. And Bragg's forces decided that they would attack at this point, as Rosecrans' men were trying to come across this river. And the Union did get beaten back, so the South was having the better of the fighting, and they fell back a little bit, but they did not break. So they were able to hold up and stop their defensive line, so they kind of did a little bit of a tactical retreat. There really wasn't a real winner here. Neither side won by a lot, but again, the North, with all of their people, had reinforcements coming in, and so the Union reinforcements were starting to arrive. And so Bragg decided, well, if they've got more people, we don't have more people to replace ours with, and eventually we'll get defeated. So Bragg decided to retreat. General George B. McClellan was in charge of the troops on the eastern part, which was kind of the bigger part of the war, heading towards Richmond, right from Washington, D.C. there. And he was sent on a campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia, known as the Peninsula Campaign, because they started out on a peninsula. They took ships with their men and were able to start out there. And so a little bit about General McClellan is he was kind of a slow, wanted to get all of his people trained, wanted everything to happen exactly the way that he wanted it to, and he just wanted to slow down and make sure everything was right before he attacked. And so this kind of made him move a little bit slow and made him a little bit unpopular. And so that was, a little bit difficult for Lincoln and other people to accept. Okay, and so he kind of ends up failing because of that issue. So the Peninsula Campaign, it took McClellan came around with his ships on this line right here, okay, and landed here on March 17th. And it took him right around 30 days to get to and take over Yorktown. Okay, so he got there, took it over, which gave the Confederates plenty of time to ready up all their defenses right here. Okay, ready up all their defenses for Richmond. All right, and so that gave them way too much time. He moved way too slow. He was way too cautious. He needed to just go in and attack and accept some losses and take Yorktown. Then, as he moved his troops up, you can see the blue lines all moving up. Okay, there were a few battles on the way, but when he got to set up his positions here at the 7 Days battle, he allowed a river to divide his troops. He allowed this Chickahominy River, Okay, you see it goes through, and some of his offensive lines were on this side of the river, and other offensive lines were on the other side of the river. So I'll try and clear this now. Okay, so what ended up happening is General Robert E. Lee decided to attack the divided troops, and he attacked and forced really heavy casualties on them, which forced McClellan to retreat. Now, did he win? Did he totally take over the army? Did he take them all prisoner? No, it wasn't a decisive win. It wasn't a 100% win, but it did make the North retreat, and they lost a lot of troops. And so when he was retreating, Lincoln ordered a withdrawal of the troops and ordered McClellan to come back to Washington, D.C. To defend Washington, D.C. And so McClellan was not happy about this, but he marched his troops back to Washington, D.C. So as McClellan is retreating, Lee decides to take a bold move and attack the Union forces that were defending Washington, D.C. It ended up being on the same battle place as the first battle of the war, the Bull Run. This is the second battle of Bull Run. The South again forced the North to retreat at this point and took that battlefield, took that land. And so this meant that the South was very close. They were only 20 miles from Washington, D.C., from the capital of the Union, to be able to shut this whole thing down and attack Washington, D.C., right? And so, with this victory, General Lee was emboldened, and he decided that it needed to be done. He decided to invade the North. Okay, and this is one of the big mistakes that General Lee made in the beginning, when he was mostly not making mistakes. Okay, his thought was, if we go in and we attack them, we might get a few things to fall our way. We might convince the North to accept independence of the South if we can go into their land, defeat them, and let them understand that we're going to win. Okay, we might also help get the South recognized by the British if we go into the North and can show that we can win victories there. We might also help the Peace Democrats in the upcoming election, and if the Peace Democrats take over, the war ends, and instead they will negotiate. And the other thing that was positive is he would be able to feed his troops not from the southern farms, which didn't have much food, but feed his troops from the northern people's farms. And so that would be positive too. And so Lee decided to set up his troops over here in Sharpsburg. And start to get them together there. And McClellan had his troops set up just to the east of it at the Antietam Creek. Okay, and so it was kind of setting up for a major battle. Take a moment to write out your response to checkpoint number 2 question. So in the Battle of Antietam happened on September 17th, 1862. McClellan ordered his troops to attack from the Antietam Creek and attack Lee's troops near Sharpsburg, Maryland. This was a one-day battle. It only lasted one day, and it was the bloodiest one-day battle in all of American history. On September 17th, 1862, 6,000 troops were killed and 17,000 troops were injured. That's a total of 23,000 casualties from this single day of battle, American casualties. And in this, Lee was running out of troops. It's not that the North were killing more than the South. Actually, the South killed more than the North, but they were running out of people in the South. They didn't have as many people. They needed to be doing a defensive war like their original plan was. But again, this was kind of the mistake that was made. And so Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia. And so he did that, and this was an enormous Union victory. Even though more Union troops died than Confederate troops, it was a huge victory because this kept Britain out of the war. It kept Europe out of the war. Britain was ready to get involved. They were ready to recognize the South and join forces with them maybe if the South had won. They were willing to kind of step up and do that. But because the South had not won this invasion into the North, Britain decided to stay out of it for the remainder of the war. So, in the politics side of this, while all of this is happening, there was a lot of fights and decision making about ending slavery. And so, the Democrats we know were against ending slavery. The Republicans were split. There were abolitionists. There were people that just said, no, we don't need to end slavery. We just need to get the country back together. Lincoln decided it needed to be done. We needed to end slavery. We needed to take that charge and just be done with it, especially in the South. And so he said if we can drive the Southern troops out of northern soil, get them out of Maryland, win these battles, then he would end slavery. And so on September 22nd, after the Battle of Antietam, 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. This basically said, and it's kind of interesting to look at, this said that all slaves would be freed in the states that are still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863. So it was just the slaves would be freed in the South. In the Confederate states that had broken off. The slave states that were part of the North, they were not freed. Okay, and the reason for that is because Abraham Lincoln still needed them on his side. He needed those states on his side. So it didn't apply at all to the states in the Union. It only applied to the Confederate states. And really, did it do much? No, it didn't, because I mean, it was more symbolic than anything, because it didn't really free the people in the South. They weren't listening to the rules of another government that they thought they had broken off from. Okay, and so it didn't really do a whole lot in effect, but it had a big symbolic effect, and it changed the entire point of the war. Before, it was a war to preserve the Union, bring people back together. Now it was a war to free the slaves. It was a war about liberty and about freedom, which more people could buy into and be able to fight quite a bit stronger on that basis, rather than just on why are we trying to get these people back into our country that don't want to be a part of it. Take a minute to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test questions you might see on the quiz or a test.